Founded in 2009 by Helen Armstrong, Silver Cloud is a global HR and payroll technology consultancy headquartered in the UK. Passionate about putting people first, we work in true partnership with our clients, working to find the best solution for all of their people tech problems. We now work with HR leaders all over the world, helping them achieve impactful strategic goals. Whether it's finding a better understanding of your current HR system or implementing something new, having the help of a skilled consultant can make all the difference. No matter what part of the journey you're on, find out more at silvercloudhr.co.uk.
Hello and welcome. My name is Anna Johnson. I work for a company called Silver Cloud and we are a HR and payroll tech consultancy. We have been going around since 2009 and today we have the pleasure, not just me, I have a few other people joining me later on today to talk to you about a global payroll transformation case study from chaos to control. So this is some of the learnings that we've kind of had over the years, helping other clients like yourselves that may be kind of going through the transformation journeys now. So some of the things that we suggest you look out for.
So tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, everybody, I'm Eve. I'm the transformation lead here at the Dayforce practice at Silver Cloud. I work very closely with clients on all sorts of projects from sort of prime end-to-end implementations, but also work with clients already live on the optimization of their system.
Because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was like what payroll chaos actually looks like in reality and kind of what you've seen day-to-day organizations kind of go through before they realize that something has to change. So what are your thoughts on that?
So it essentially means payroll chaos, that the team are firefighting. They are having to work reactively and not proactively. So working through, quite often we see they're working with a huge backlog of queries, of corrections that need to be made. When you are global and you have sort of payroll across different locations, it means that things quite often you have different payroll calendars, so those cut-off points are different. Payrolls are being committed at all different points in time. It makes it very hard to have sort of one standard process there, and to get, like, look at the finance team, they're asking for things as they have deadlines, but it's very difficult for them to get that when payroll is so fragmented. We do often see as well there's a lot of manual work involved in it, so a lot of spreadsheets being held outside of systems, manual processes. When you have, sometimes quite often you may have different systems across locations or no system at all, so it then becomes very, very difficult in terms of having standardized processes, and it does have an impact, even from a compliance perspective. Sort of the ability to accurately track and report on certain data then becomes very, very difficult, and we do see that quite a lot with clients that have sort of fragmented systems and data across different points as well.
And it sounds like an absolute nightmare. I'm sure quite a few of our audiences may be able to relate to some of that, but we definitely want to be able to help other organizations. I guess if some of the things that like Eve has kind of like shared with us today, just around the type of chaos, could they sound and they resonate with what you're experiencing in-house? I guess it's probably time that these organizations need to start thinking about potentially doing something. We don't want to break teams, do we? And I mean, having been in many different in-house companies doing and supporting payroll functions, I've also seen it when you get everything last minute, and that's quite crazy as well, isn't it? Like, people are trying to put bonuses last minute through, trying to process late payments. I'm sure you've seen this as well, right, Eve?
Yeah, those new hires that come up on the day you're supposed to press the button, and you've got new hires coming through, terminations coming through, I should say, those last minute payments that need to be made, or even to stop a payment as well, if it's like actually
risk there, right? So
absolutely,
you could be losing, these companies could be losing money as well, making payments, then not being able to get those funds back, especially if the employees are also leaver, or you've overpaid on holiday, right? That's another one that I saw quite a lot, working closely with payroll teams. So yeah, finance teams. I mean, I remember, bringing finance professionals and the CFO coming across in different organizations, trying to again get that final sign off, and then last minute changes happening. It's not a great place to be, is it? If you're here, and obviously the wider the scope that the company is, different locations, different geographies, the more complicated it becomes. You've probably seen different types of makeup, I guess, in teams, payroll teams, and how the impact could be slightly different. What do you see in terms of fragmented when the system's not quite all joined up together and that chaos happening?
It's quite often the variations in process in each location. So where you've got specific local processes rather than a standardized global one. If you have local teams perhaps with no sort of single ownership point that sort of oversees all of that and connects the dots together. That's where quite often you find that it causes further issue in terms of ensuring employees are paid accurately and on time as well. So it's definitely something that if going forward, if that is where you are at the moment, if you do have sort of payroll teams for admin, HR admins spread across locations that have their own processes, then that does need to be reviewed to see where the opportunity is for the standardization, so that you're not going forward with it. Say you're looking at a new system, you don't end up just replicating that and having the same issues that you do today.
Definitely. That sounds like some really great advice there, Ethan. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'd like to talk a little bit around the chaos around data as well. I mean, that's another thing that, I'm not a payroll person by trade, but I know you are, and I know you would have seen this, and we've had quite a few examples of recent times where companies are just not getting that data visibility, right? What sort of things would they be experiencing themselves, just on the chaos side of things, that they should be looking out for as well, just so that we can really paint the true picture of what this really looks like? Some examples would be amazing there.
So examples in terms of data, I think what I've quite seen quite often when there's no sort of single source of truth is employee data that is held maybe outside system on separate spreadsheets.
Yeah.
You may have certain systems and locations and theirs is on the system, but there's no sort of single source of truth there. So when it comes to trying to get the insights like headcount out of that data, it becomes very difficult. I mean, I've seen clients not even be able to pull something that should be simple, like that a headcount report by location, because if you have data in systems, outside of systems, all in different formats and location, perhaps it's not very clean because there's no maintenance there. It's very hard to pull that all together to get certain insights and sort of key metrics like turnover rate and things like that. The key sort of metrics that drive business decisions, it becomes very hard to do. And I've seen a lot of clients in that sort of position, and it's just having that lack of single source of truth and having it sort of spread over so many different locations and formats that does impact your ability to pull simple things out of it.
Yeah. It's again, I've got numerous companies that we've worked with in the past, isn't it? That where that's been one of the pain points that they describe to us as not being able to do. They want one source of truth, they want real data visibility, they want to be able to make well-informed strategic decisions off the back of data. But at whatever point, if this becomes a struggle, I guess, just as you say, it's time to start looking at your processes, the way in which you operate, and how you are managing your payroll function. And that may lead you to a global payroll transformation of some type, right? So what would you say are the points where a company may go, it's time, and what would potentially stop them from going, I don't want to do it right now. There's never a right time, right? Nobody wants to upset people getting paid. It's one of the biggest touch points that we see employees having. So at what point, when is a good time for an organization to really think about transforming the payroll function?
It varies so much, I think, depending on each individual business where they are. I think there's a few sort of considerations there. First of all, with sort of identifying if it's time. I think if you're in a position where you don't know how many employees you have in a single location. Obviously, that's quite a big red flag. In terms of sort of compliance risk, just looking at the UK specifically, if we talk about things such as national minimum wage, there's new legislation come in where you have to track holiday pay and you have to track all the leave taken. If the data has been stored in sort of manual spreadsheets, or that you're working with a huge backlog of backdated changes, that instantly is going to impact your ability to actually report. But it does pose the risk of, are you actually compliant there as well, in terms of, are employees getting paid correctly? Are you paying them national minimum wage? Are you paying their holiday pay correctly? And each country, of course, and location has its own legislation, but it does become very difficult. And I think one of the things that we've seen quite often in terms of when a company gets this position is it does come across in terms of the volume of queries. So you may have something like ServiceNow, which has ticketing. I mean, we've seen organisations with thousands of tickets coming in that are sort of dated sort of even over a year ago. I think straight away, if you're dealing with this huge volume of tickets, that's again a flag to say something needs to be changed here, and we need to look at this. And then it's ultimately going to impact sort of the rate of turnover you're seeing there, in terms of like even grievances. You're likely to get more upset employees because they're not getting paid on time and they're not getting paid correctly, so they're going to escalate that. It has that impact on your administration team as well. Are they going to burn out? There's a big impact across. So when considering when to do it, I think that is sometimes, as you say, you may think, oh no, we can't do this right now, but actually, what is the risk there with not doing
anything at all, right?
Yeah,
and it could, like you say, it could even affect like brand reputation as well of the organization, where unhappy employees then don't talk positively about the organization. So definitely, if some of the things that we've talked about today resonate, it's probably time. So Rebecca, welcome. Would you like to just give the audience a brief introduction about yourself today?
Of course. So my name is Rebecca Addison. I head up the client transformation team at Silver Cloud. My background and my career has been all based around HR and payroll transformation programs. I've worked in consultancies, but I've also implemented several large systems in a variety of different sectors. In fact, private sector, public sector, all sorts. So I've sat on both sides of the fence. So I understand the sort of pain points of going through a project implementation all too well.
Amazing. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us today. So just so that the audience get a little bit more intel from you and all the lovely experience that you've had, specifically, what are the things that companies should be considering before they actually even go into selection from a cost perspective?
Okay. Yeah, so I guess there's the kind of the really obvious cost that you would think about as you go through your selection process. So that includes the license cost from the vendor, the implementation cost that you might get from the actual vendor, but also those additional costs that you might want to include around implementation that you shouldn't forget about, which is really about any additional consultancy support you might need, any contractors or additional resource that you might need to bring into the project. Think about your existing and legacy systems as well. So at what point the contract expires on those systems. So you might have a crossover period between the systems. So make sure you account for that as you go through your finances. You don't, all too often organisations kind of leave it too late and fall off a cliff with their legacy system and have either to take on board expensive renewals for a year or have to rush the project.
There is a key, isn't there, almost around timing.
Such a delicate balance around that timing. Yeah.
I've definitely seen organisations that, they don't want to notify their existing, global payroll providers that they're going to be, having a change or moving along to a new provider. So they leave decisions to quite last minute, and then the project doesn't quite go to plan, and then they end up having to, as you said, extend the licensing. Some of vendors won't do it for just a year or rolling monthly contracts. They'll try and tie those clients in for another 3 to 5 years, based on where the terms. So they really need to look at those elements.
You do really need to think about it. And the alternative is that, you have to rush your implementation to make sure that you get it in on time. And then there's a cost for that as well, in terms of there'll be mistakes as you go through inevitably. If you're rushing your implementation, you're going to have mistakes that come out the other end. And, that's all part of the process. But if you can get that timing right, then you do tend to save yourself a bit of cost. So those are sort of the more obvious costs, but there's hidden costs as well that sometimes just sting, that if you haven't thought them through, you haven't forgotten them, if you've forgotten them. So there is one of the kind of things that people often underestimate as you go through an implementation is the amount of time it takes to do the data. So making sure you've got enough resource and the right resource to do that. It is challenging to get the data out of legacy systems. Often I see it all the time that people that are really struggling to get the right data out of the system.
And vendors they're not happy to be helpful, especially if you've told them that you're leaving, right?
Exactly, not always. And then once you've got the data out, you then have to transform it and get it into the templates for the new system. It's not an easy process, and it's really challenging. So don't underestimate that, would be my advice. You probably will need additional support to go through that. And it's absolutely critical that you get it right, because of course you need to get the right data into your new system during your go live window. And typically you have a short time window to do that as you go live.
There's multiple points, isn't there, where the data has to be extracted for the global payroll solutions.
So usually you'll extract it. Typically you would do at least 3 data extractions and loads. You'll do one to start with, so as a kind of your first data extraction to get the system set up and running, so you can see your all structure within the system. Perhaps carry out your UAT testing on it. You then typically do another one to do your parallel runs, so you would get a fresh data set to run through your parallels, and then obviously you've got your go live data set again, which would be a fresh cut of data. So you do get a chance to practice. However, each time you do that, you've got to get it better, you've got to get it slicker. Typically during the cutover window, you may only have 2 to 3 weeks to get that data extracted, cleansed, transformed, validated, and then reloaded back into the system. So don't underestimate that, is my advice, because that often trips people up. The sort of error correction cycles, once you do go live, you may find that it's a new system, everyone's learning, there's going to be mistakes, so you have to think about how you're going to correct those mistakes afterwards. So just think about any kind of off-cycle pay runs that you need to do to get those things right. So just don't underestimate that as well. Obviously in the ideal world everything will go perfectly, but in the real world there are usually a few things that kind of don't quite hit the mark, so you just have to be aware of those and be ready to fix them. The other thing I would say is a really critical one, and something I would say that you need to think about as you go through your implementation as well, is really around the compliance risk. So making sure that you've kind of met your compliance requirements, you understand what they are. Hopefully you don't incur any costs from it, but obviously there is the chance that if you don't get your compliance right, you could. Make sure that you involve your kind of data governance and your data protection team right from the start of your project. They will have a lot to say about it. They will want to be involved. There'll be DPIAs to write. And don't underestimate the amount of time that takes, because payroll systems and HR systems by their nature involved a lot of personal data and a lot of sensitive data. So you need to make sure that you're meeting those compliance requirements as well as all your kind of statutory ones. So
what about like where data is hosted? I think that's something as well that I've heard clients having an opinion as well around where data is hosted, and maybe something that
I mean, I think for everyone, I think most payrollers are well aware of data security and how to protect people's personal data. It's kind of bread and butter and what we do on a day-to-day basis. But you're absolutely right. So where, as you go through your procurement process, you'll need to be asking questions around, is the data processed in Europe? Is it processed overseas? What are the governance protections around that? What's the GDPR process? So again, that's all sits within the remit of your DPO. So make sure they're well involved in the process and kind of can make sure that that contract meets all those requirements for your business. Every business is slightly different and has different kind of levels of compliance around this. So just make sure that you're involving those people right from the start.
Amazing. And if I was to say to you, like, what is the biggest surprise people come up with from a costing perspective? What would you say that is?
Again, I'd probably say it's around the resource. I think it always costs more than you think to get the right resources in place to deliver the projects. Projects are really tricky in terms of payroll teams have a lot of BAU to manage all the time. That stuff doesn't drop off a cliff when you start going through a project. You have to manage both. And so the biggest mistake I see people do as they go through these projects is think that the payroll team can manage both, that they can do BAU and project. And they can't, is my honest, feedback on it. You need key people from your payroll team involved in the implementation so they can bring the business perspective to stuff. They know how the business payroll works, all the kind of key pain points, all the things that go well. So you need their experience. So you need to bring some of them into the project, but you need to make sure you've got that balance between making sure your BAU team is still able to process the payroll and keep the wheels turning and keep the lights on in your kind of BAU world.
It's a sensitive time, isn't it? Because
it's a really, really difficult time, and it's very, very stressful on people. And this always underestimated. And I think particularly for payrollers, they're not always used to working in project environments. So to have the pressure of both BAU, which is always stressful for them, and then the project as well, it can be really difficult. And I think, often with payrollers, they're so careful about making sure that everything's right and everything's precise and everything's perfect, because that comes with their job and comes with their territory, and that's how they need to be successful in their role. So the ambiguity and the kind of variation of working on a project can be really, really difficult. So make sure you've got the right resources and support for your team, and bring in some experts or some contractors to help bolster the team and bring that kind of knowledge in that can help support your BAU team.
Yeah. How do you think organizations best kind of can deal with, that uncertainty, especially for, let's say you're completely maybe changing your target operating model completely, and, it's going to have an impact in the way you operate. So you might have gone from an in-house payroll and you're now going to outsource it. You're going into a global transformation project. How do you make sure, in your opinion, what have you seen works best to try and keep the team engaged in such a sensitive time where potentially there's fear of job losses along the way?
Yeah, there's two really critical aspects to this, and I think it's, in a nutshell, it's good project management and good change management. And those two things I think are just really important to keep everyone aligned. So your project management, you need a great project manager that's keeping, everything ticking along, but also is keeping everyone really well informed about what's happening. The last thing you want to do is do this stuff in secret and then impose it on people. So bring people along the journey, make sure they're engaged, make sure the right people are involved. But that your project management that your project's well governed, that everything's kind of kept as close to project plan as possible, and where it doesn't, that's well communicated. But then also the change management piece is absolutely critical. So putting any new system in is going to involve changes in the way that you work, changes in your processes, changes in the way you engage with the system, end user experience changes. There's so much change that comes along with one of these project implementations that you need a really strong change management program to go alongside that. And that includes really good training for your operational team, so your HR and your payroll team, so they know exactly how to use the system, what there is expected of them. I've had examples before where you've kind of gone live and then almost expected the payroll team just to be able to pick up a new system, and it just doesn't happen. It's it's completely different.
You lose adoption from the beginning. And I had an example as well a couple of weeks ago, and the client was going through the parallel, and they had a project team that was non-BAU team, and they basically we're going live in less than a month, and our payrollers don't know how to run the payroll. They don't know the system. Please help. So that meant that the organization had to invest additional time upskilling those individuals to bring them along on board, build their trust up, so that by the time they got to go live, they then didn't have that risk of not being able to process and the whole system not being successful as a result of it. So
And vendors will always push you to a tight time frame. You know, they will. That's how they operate. And you know, in an ideal world, you know, there's a perfect project plan which runs exactly to time. But you
Is
know
there
your
such a thing,
business,
Rebecca?
but not in reality, on a piece of paper. But
Yeah.
in reality, you know your business, you know the things where there's going to be challenges, you know the stakeholders that are going to be really difficult, you understand the nuances of having different pay groups or different pay policies and how that needs to be fed into the system. And payroll is complex. I mean, once you've got it set up right in the system, it should flow through quite simply and easily, and that's the ultimate end goal that you want to get to. But putting those building blocks in place as you go through the implementation is difficult. And again, this comes back to that point around time and making sure that you've allowed enough time to train up your teams and share the changes that are going through the organisation.
So, Rebecca,
Okay, so Anna,
welcome.
you are the expert here. So what would you say the selection process should look like, and what are sort of the common things that can be overlooked as part of that?
So I guess the first thing that we like to do is to consult widely. So you need to understand in your business who your key stakeholders are going to be in the process. So anybody from HR, from payroll. Sometimes we see payroll team sitting under HR. Other times we see them sitting under finance. I'm sure you see that as well. And you know, depending on where payroll sits, that can also introduce a number of challenges
Yeah.
either side, doesn't it? We like to also involve the likes of IT, who always have quite a lot of passion around integrations, and we'll want to make sure the architecture of your business is well connected, especially in global payroll projects. And then you need to have like some key sponsorship. So again, if you're trying to get a project through, do a selection, and you don't have any senior sponsorship, you're going to struggle to actually get anything through. So try and find out in your business who those roles are going to be played by, and start trying to understand their needs, right? Different groups of people will have different needs. And as I said, capturing requirements across the business is going to be very important, especially in those global payrolls. So you need to think about, if I really focus this around the payroll side of things, how many countries you're in, how many payrolls you've got in each one of those countries, what are the local legislations. So when you're capturing your requirements, it's really important to note down the things that are working today well with your existing providers, and also the things that you may be having problems with, turn them into a requirement. We've also seen like vendors, actually, a lot of the vendors will be able to do what you want to do, right? Otherwise there wouldn't be payroll vendors and they wouldn't be going out there. But what we find is that it's more how they do things that impact the way and where that is going to work or not work for you as an organization. And it's really digging deep that will help you try and understand that. So understand your stakeholders as a starting point. Think about your requirements and start capturing them. Make sure you write them in a way that the vendors are going to understand and they're not going to try and get around it. We like to Moscow rate them. So are they must-haves? Are they should-haves? Are they could-haves? Are they won't-haves? But things that you want to know whether the vendor could do or not do for future reference. We also like to put together what we call a costing calculator. The vendors will be providing you costings, and in order for you to be able to actually like understand whether the vendors are giving you the same service offering and the costing things in the same way, you need to give them some sort of structure. So always detail the modular functionality that you're trying to achieve, the countries, the number of employees that you've got in each country. You know, obviously earlier on, Eve, we were talking about some companies, you know, struggling to get those numbers, but as close as you can to it, because that will affect the pricing that the vendors put forward. We also like to list out integrations. So there may be other systems in your organization that need payroll data, or payroll data needs to get information from other systems. So a key one there would be your HR system needing to integrate with the payroll, especially if you go in to a standalone payroll provider as part of your global payroll selection. And you may also find that some of the vendors have already got pre-existing relationships with some existing HR providers. So that makes those integration conversations either easier or cheaper to calculate and put forward. So at this stage, so you've got your stakeholders, you've got your requirements, you've Moscow rated them to make sure that, you know, you understand your priorities. Everybody's engaged because you've involved them all the way through. You've got your costing calculator, so everybody's providing you everything like for like. And you're now going to send that out to a range of vendors. But first of all, you need to understand which vendors could potentially meet your needs, right? There are so many out there, right? And so many of these vendors globally can provide different services. So I'd say before even going there, you need to think about how you want to operate in the future. And we did touch on this a little bit earlier. I touched on this with Rebecca, just around the target operating model. The vendors will want to know whether you want to run the payroll in-house, whether you want to run it managed, whether you want to run it partly managed. So all those things impact price and how the vendors are providing those numbers for you to be able to compare. So remember, like making sure that that target operating model is completely clear is going to help you define the future model of your organization globally. The vendors will then have, sorry, you carry on.
I was going to say there's a few things that like key points that you've touched on there. I think in terms of requirements, again, really specific about your requirements to go into those demos with and asking to see those. And making sure that anything say that is truly complex or unique to yourselves. I think in terms of, you mentioned the operating model, and I think perhaps that may be some areas that may not be considered when it comes to selection, is actually having that in order and having that design in place before going out to selection, and not doing it as an after piece of work.
Afterthought.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I was talking to an organisation last week. They're going and they've got a merger happening, and this is adding complexity because the merging company's got different payroll providers, right? Very interesting, right? They now need to. They're at a standstill point. They need to decide whether, the payroll processing and the way they do payroll globally today works for them. Whether they're going to wait until the merging company comes in before they do something. They're trying to absorb them. So all that operating model has to really be thought of. And I guess if you've got different people singing from different hymn sheets, and I think that's one thing we sometimes see. I'm sure you've seen that as well, Eve, where different leaders have got, I guess, different perspectives of how payroll should look, whether it should be run in-house, whether it should be outsourced. It's really going to impact it. And it's quite a sensitive time as well, right? If you are thinking of changing your target operating model, the people that are running your payroll today are going to be very sensitive about it. And then that alone puts an element of risk. So it's quite a sensitive time when you're going through selection that has to be really carefully thought out, so that people don't feel any kind of threat of the roles being either made redundant or being redeployed into doing other things. So it has to be very carefully managed. But you also talked about, like you were asking around the demonstrations and being able to really understand whether the vendors are going to be able to fulfill the needs. I'd say look at the market before you send out your tender. So look at what vendors potentially at a high level could meet your needs. This obviously you can use AI if you want, or you can bring in a consultancy to come and help you like narrow down your list. SilverCloud, we help other organizations do this and just help narrow down based on what we know of the industry. So it's always really helpful to try and understand the market. You could end up just going from a friend's recommendation, or one of your senior leaders may have a particular vendor that they've worked with before and they've had good experience. Likewise, they may have had a bad experience and they don't want to include them in the tender process. We get that quite a few times as well. So things that are essential, like to make sure that you're defining in the process. It's like the type of you're not going to try and bring, if you're going to really look at your global payroll offering, not just recreating what you've already got. You've probably got dispersed different vendors today. They're all doing their own things. You're trying to couple data together to be able to present to your board on a monthly basis. So don't just, try and recreate what you've already got. Like really think about the process. You've probably got contracts at different stages. So you might have some in-country providers doing some things. You might have some local teams actually running your payroll using in-country payroll providers software. So really dig down into what's going on in your organization. Those global organizations will have a lot of disparity, and it's nobody's fault. It's because of the organization's probably changed over time and it's grown through acquisitions over time that's caused those systems to be the way they are today. And think about the type of configuration that you want the system to have. You want to have some flexibility, but you don't want to compromise the processes that have to be followed locally. Again, I think you've seen this as well, haven't you, Eve?
Yes, I have. And I've definitely been in the seat of seeing, as you mentioned, where you've got different processes and the impact on being able to get the data from each of those teams and put in a single dashboard as well to present to the board. Yeah, I've seen the impact of that. I suppose one thing that I'm sure everyone is interested in is, so say an organisation decides they decide to do this themselves in terms of selection, not work with someone such as ourselves to help them with that process. What would you say is the sort of biggest watch out, what you've seen that's made selection fail?
Selection fail. So the biggest thing, people not being clear on what they want. So they've decided to go out to tender and really explore the market, but not really knowing where they wanted to end up. So there's probably three, like not having sponsorship. There's a couple. Not having that sponsorship. I think that has caused, I mean, we had some projects a couple of years ago where they went all the way through to finally selecting the vendors and then decided that the time just wasn't right for them. So the sponsorship level, and that could be because the sponsor has decided to leave midway through the project, right? So then you've got to try and bring somebody else on board that hasn't been part of that journey. Really important to make sure that people are really together. And then the other thing that's probably stopped selections like proceeding is getting to the contractual stage with the vendors, and those contractuals just not aligning to the expectations or things coming out of the woodwork because the clarity hasn't been put in front of the vendor in the first place. So the prices that were originally submitted differed to what was put in the tender. So that sometimes makes people go back to the drawing board before proceeding, especially when they compare things to what they're paying today, which is actually, that really helps the business case side of things as well. If like really understanding like your costing and the case of why you're trying to do what you're doing and positioning that to the vendors along your requirements. So we like to do almost like a rationale document that we provide to all the vendors that we ask to participate, that positions the business and what it is that they're trying to achieve. So really try and get that pulled together. Once you've gone out to tender, as you can imagine, everybody's super excited and all vendors want to win this. You'll now have acquired however many vendors, new best friends, because they want your attention, they want to make an impression. And very quickly you will know which vendors feel right and which vendors don't feel right in the process. Again, if you're managing this yourself instead of using an external party to support you along the process, you're probably going to be absolutely bombarded until you get to speak to them directly and until you speak to the vendors. They will submit the tenders to you. You can decide to analyse that quantitative data, and what we typically do is we narrow down the list from typically 8 vendors down to 3. Those 3 vendors then get invited to come along to do demonstrations of the solutions, and the demos are quite a key stage because that is the beauty parade, right? At that stage is not just it's not about the what can they do in paper, how much is it going to cost me, you know all that information already. They're now there to impress you. So there we like to bring also like some of the day-to-day users of the solutions. So we'd bring your payroll professionals. If you say HR selection, you'd bring your HR team, you might bring finance, IT and so on. So you try and get a different perspective. We try and limit the time that you do those demonstrations in. So we might say you have got an allocated slot of 3 hours to demonstrate your solution or demonstrate your offering to the client. And then you will break that down into a set of sections that the vendors have to go through. Again, it's really important to give vendors structure in the demo. So again, so you can compare like for like as you are evaluating what they've presented to you. So we like to have an area where they show the functionality of the solution. If it is going to be a software that you are going down the route of, if it's a services side of things, we ask them to demonstrate how they would handle certain scenarios. We ask them to talk to us about their implementation methodology, so how they go about bringing us on board if it is a managed service, or how they go about us absorbing that software. And then we also talk about the relationship, right? Really important. The SaaS contracts that we've got nowadays are not just a here's a little bit of paper that you've signed on and goodbye. They're relationships, right? So clients want to be looked after, and they are providing you with a service. So you want to make sure that that service is super well delivered for however long that relationship is for. And when you're talking about a global payroll selection, if you're talking anything from like 3 years upwards, you're not going to be going to do this. Most companies take, in the region of anything. If it's just payroll on its own, it could be like 3-4 months, depending on the number of parallels. If you then bring in HR with payroll, you're talking 9-12 months, if not a year and a half. So you're going to be spending a substantial amount of time getting the new landscape put in place. You need to make sure that your teams are upskilled, right? So it's got to be the right decision. What we like to do after we've done the demonstrations is put together a survey for the attendees that basically collates their feedback, right? So what did they think about the solution? What did they think about the service offering? Again, and we would tailor that to what the selection type has been in line with the target operating model that the company's chosen to go with. We then use the data that we've gathered in the RFP. So all the quantitative data together with the qualitative data from the vendor surveys, and we put that together to give us an overall score of the preferred vendor solution. And at that stage, I think 9 out of 10 times, most clients have already got to the stage where they have identified their preferred vendor. They typically would have to then notify all unsuccessful vendors again. If you've got an external company working with you, that's something that the external company like us would be dealing with and providing feedback to the vendors. But if not, you're going to be taking a number of phone calls and really responding as to why they have not made it through either to demonstration or they haven't made it past to the next stage. So yeah, really the process can take anything from around 3 months on selections, roughly, obviously depending on your complexities as a business and how many people you have to bring in the loop, and especially your geographical coverage, right? If you want to run them as almost independent processes, what I've described on here, you could run per country and then try and bring it all together to really ensure that you're consulted widely. If you've got a centralized payroll function, for example, and you're just dealing with one team, it's going to take a little bit less time. So I guess the first thing so companies that are going through global payroll transformations should be asking of vendors, right, to really get down in the bonnet and make sure that they're making the right selections, and they're not going to make any of the same mistakes that they're making today, right, which we talked about earlier as well. So shall we start with you, Eve?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, of course, if you're a global organization, you need to make sure that your vendor is able to support a global operating model. So you don't just want to know that they are able to support sort of processing of specific countries. You need to know that it is that global operating model. And then depend on the modules you have as well, that flow through from one module to the next. So a lot of systems, each feature is dependent on the other. So you want to ensure if you have a population of employees that are heavily shift based and you're dependent on how the timesheet works, how those calculations come through, you actually want to see how that feeds into payroll. Are there any manual steps involved that are going to increase the effort for the team, as an example? So you definitely want to drill down into that. I know we've talked about sort of the specifics of your requirements, but that does feed into it, because quite a lot of times you may have a system that can support specific countries, but it's not exactly how you'd expect. So other things you may want to look at is the sort of what that model is. Will it be in-house? Do they support managed services in terms of payroll as well? And how that varies by country. So are you going to have to have a different
seen that
process?
before, haven't we? Different countries, and some vendors almost don't really promote that they have in-country payroll partners, right? Which is actually quite interesting. So they're saying they can cover all countries, but the question that leaders should really be asking is like, how can they actually cover and provide that coverage country by country? Because as you've just said, right, it could vary, and very significantly, country to country, right?
Yeah, and is it true native payroll as well, as you say? Are they just supporting the country, but it's not native payroll, so you wouldn't have the ability to run that in-house as well, as you say? So definitely worth sort of digging deep into that if that is a requirement for yourselves. I'd say as well is you want to talk about sort of the industries that they work with, any that you want to get specific examples to organisations like yourself as well. And I would recommend as part of that to ask what could go wrong. So what problems have they seen based on those initial requirements? Sort of if you look in 6-12 months go live, what can happen at that point? So getting the examples from the vendors, so you are getting a full picture, and also so you can prevent making those same mistakes and have those decisions in the early stages so you don't end up in the same position.
I really like sometimes asking, what the worst implementation kind of looks like. So you're kind of putting them on the spot. And I also quite like trying to get like non-biased references from clients. So I try and reach out to my network just to see, anybody that's using it, that particular global payroll provider, and what experience they've had. So they're not kind of pre-arranged by the vendor. Like all vendors, especially in the payroll space, I think most of us would have seen this, will have what they like to call the VIP clients, right? And those very important clients are the ones that they put in front of other clients to try and get, additional business, people following them.
I was going to say they're always going to, if you ask them for a reference, they're always going to give you the ones where things have gone well. You need to find the clients where they have maybe things haven't gone quite according to plan, but then perhaps they've kind of rectified it, or they've ended up with a really good result. But so you can understand what those pain points are as you go through the process.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? And just I'm sure you've got some lovely questions that leaders should be asking as well, Rebecca. What other things, in your opinion, do you think leaders should be asking?
I think it is really, what are those kind of killer questions almost? What's sort of really unique to our organisation? Because you'll find that lots of the vendors can provide a vast majority of the functionality, but every organisation is different. So what is that kind of, what are those key things that makes your organisation different, that will help you sift through the vendors to find the right one for your fit? And also think about what kind of system you want. So think about your employee experience and that side of it as well. So is it really important to you that that is it more that you want to meet those compliance and reporting requirements and make sure all of those boxes are ticked, or is it you want a system that people can engage with really easily? All of those different things you need to feed into your decision making. So being really clear on what those key points are for your organisation that are going to make a difference to your system choice.
Amazing. No, that's really great. And what about, what sort of questions should we be encouraging people to ask in terms of how success is measured in a global payroll implementation? What sort of questions do you think leaders should be asking of the vendors?
I think from my perspective, it's a lot of it is about the user experience. So there's end users as well. So the adoption of the system. If they what that means in terms of, so at the moment you may be having challenges in terms of your employees, they can't do simple things such as logging in, viewing payslip, and that
that is the ultimate basis thing, right? The payroll, people knowing what they're getting paid and being able to see it.
Absolutely, and you'll know straight away, sort of once you're live, when you have sort of queries coming in, they don't know how to use certain features, and of course that does tie into the change management piece, but it is ultimately what you want out of the system as well in terms of that user experience. If AI is a huge thing for your organization, you want a system that has these features that will determine again which vendor you decide to go with, if that is important, as well as the reporting, what you want to get out in terms of data insights, those key metrics as well. I think that's something we've touched on as part of the selection, but again, you need to be thinking about that early on, asking those questions of vendors to make sure that you are able to get what you need to, finance can get what they need, IT can get what they need, and of course bringing those stakeholders into those initial discussions with the vendors will mean that you don't have the gaps there, but ultimately I think that when you have payroll and you have things like workforce management, timesheets, if that is relevant to yourselves as an organisation, one of the biggest flags is how much the employees actually follow the processes, how much they go in, log in the system. if they start reverting back to having those manual files and manual trackers, it's clear you're not getting what the system was intended for. So it's definitely worth considering that early on and making sure you're asking the right questions to see what that end result is, to make sure you do have that user adoption.
I did have one client a number of years ago. They shared with me they had over 100 different payroll trackers that they were dealing with, and they weren't even in that many countries. So, I mean, that's the sort of behaviour that you don't want to be seeing and diverting back to, certainly. And the measuring of the system usage and accessibility, I think for me, I'd probably like to be measuring it at different points. So as you go live, maybe 3 months later, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, just to see that adoption has increased, and maybe look at the reduction in queries or the resolution time being reduced. I'd probably be asking the vendors to provide me some statistics and numbers of how they're meeting their SLAs and how they're achieving those. Is there any other kind of KPIs or service levels that you think leaders should be asking vendors for as part of the global transformation projects?
I think from my perspective, I think that piece when you first go live is really important. So, we all know that payroll are the unsung heroes of every organisation, and what you want is for that process to be as smooth and as quiet almost as possible in terms of, queries coming in. So aside from your kind of standard payroll reports and measurements that you would as typically run as you go live, which of course it's really important to get those sorted as you go through the implementation process, that you've tested them as you do your parallel runs, so that when you go live, you know that you can get those reports out of the system that you need to ensure payroll accuracy, compliance, all those kind of good things. But to your point, Anna, it is around those kind of take-up stats and that reducing of the queries and how quickly those numbers are going down. And all vendors should have a sort of standard set of reports that they'll have in their back pockets that you can run as you go through that hypercare and that sort of go live period, just to make sure that you're getting all of that information out of the system. But keep monitoring those SLAs, make sure you've got the right people at the end of the queries to answer those tickets, and you've got a great change management plan in place to make sure that you can kind of pick up what those common queries are as they're coming through and fix those in the system so that they don't keep reoccurring.
Emma, welcome. Lovely to have you on the call. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself so that the audience know who you are?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Emma Hall, a Prince 2 certified HRS consultant with over 6 years experience in HR and payroll system implementations and in client-focused delivery. So we have got a couple of little questions for you, but I guess the area that I want to focus with you today is just around when you're thinking about global payroll transformations. Have you got some examples you can share with the audience around, when there's been a near miss, something's about to break down mid-project implementation, that you can kind of share with us of what happened, what you did to try and stop it, and how other organizations should be trying to avoid these things happening from the get-go? Yeah, okay. So probably a more recent one actually. So one of the global projects I've been working on, they have a go live date very soon, kind of 4 weeks away. It doesn't look like they're going to hit that go live date at all. Certainly not
with 4 weeks to go.
Yeah, with 4 weeks to go. And just to caveat, like I'm mid-program coming into this project, so my job now is kind of a bit of a project rescue to mitigate the risk of completely delaying the project, pushing the timeline out, or it just not going ahead at all. So when I reviewed kind of the project at its current state, there is 15 countries that are in scope. All 15 countries will not be live within 4 weeks. So we kind of went through.
That's quite ambitious, right?
Yeah. And it's really because there's been a huge delay in the requirements gathering on the client side. So first I started with why that go live date. What is the importance of the go live date? Is there specific countries that have to go live by that date for certain tax reasons or legislation requirements? And it basically transpired that actually it was an exec sponsor decision that it was, you know, going to be in 4 weeks' time. So I like the beginning of June really is their go live date.
Did they have a reason why they wanted to go live?
I think they've done early comms a bit too early on a go live date. My preference is not to give a date. It's just, you know, it's coming, you know, mid 2026, and then you slowly, as you closer get towards that date, you would then give a more definite, you know, it's going to be live in June or July or whichever. But I think early comms has meant that people are waiting. So we narrowed it down to the countries that were kind of minimum needed to go live, and that was based on certain requirements, certain modules that were going to expire with their current software, and also what comms had gone out, which is where I found that too early comms had gone out. It turned out Belgium is a must. It can't shift at all. But the good news is it meant we could shift a lot of the countries out for a later go live date rather than just not live at all. So that really mitigated the risk. We also reviewed the modules in scope and what current systems were in use. It turns out that actually time off is done by a completely different system, which is good for this scenario because it's working fine. So my motto, why fix it if it's not broken? Obviously, we want to consolidate into one system. That is the main objective of the global rollout. So the end goal is everything will be in the system. But for the purpose of getting you go live, the minimum viable product was never defined from the initiation of the project. So
that's quite interesting, isn't it? Like it's probably one of the things that we typically go in and suggest to companies to do.
It's
I guess they want to go live with everything. Everybody gets excited, don't they?
Yeah, because everybody, especially with a global rollout of HR and payroll, the project team itself is so massive. You've got a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so everyone thinks that their need is the most important, whereas actually you need to take a step back and just look at what is our minimum viable product that we cannot be without, that we have to go live with. It's non-negotiable. So we kind of went back to the beginning. We defined that, we understood it was core HR for employee records, and then payroll. Time off was done in a separate system that was working absolutely fine, brilliant. We know we can export, we know we can import time off. That is not a must-have for go live. So when we stripped out the time off module, and if anyone's ever implemented time off, you know how much of a struggle it can be, how much resource. I mean, you're talking a bare minimum 2 weeks, and that's probably just on data, never mind configuration of your time off processes and policies. So actually stripping out that module saved us so much time, which then meant the go live date could happen for Belgium and actually potentially a couple of other countries that we can bring back into scope rather than wait until September. So that was a massive mitigation of that risk. Otherwise, it either wouldn't have gone live or it would have been a very, very delayed go live date. So yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the pushback that the project team was kind of giving the sponsors. I think you briefly mentioned it to me earlier.
Yeah, so the reason why this go live date was not possible wasn't because of the date itself, in terms of that specific date. It was mainly because it was never collaborated with the project team. Nothing was ever discussed, nothing was ever confirmed. Feedback and opinions weren't taken on board. It was an executive sponsored decision of we've got to be live by this date. There was no reason or business case behind it. And for me, when we're doing a project initiation and we're defining minimal viable product, we're defining when is your definite go live date, and that can be based on critical events happening within the industry, within the organisation, or actually renewal or expiry of existing systems. That is, we factor all that in, and then every single SME that's involved in the project team, we go to them, we say, you know, okay, payroll, why do you need this date, and why would this work or not work for you? HR, you know, learning, development, talent, what, you know, we bring in all of the stakeholders and we agree on that date. more, I mean, logically, that is what you would do, right? But also from an engagement perspective, you're getting everybody's thoughts and feelings, you're taking them on board, you're making a collaborative decision together as a project team. So the responsibility's on everybody. You've all decided and confirmed on this date, so you've all got to participate, you've all got to get your data in, you've all got to get your requirements in. We're working together as one to hit a deadline.
It sounds like it's been done with them as opposed to them, which I think
exactly that. Whereas this project, that was not the case. It was a decision made from board level. This is the date that we need all countries live by. So actually, whether it was done deliberate or by accident, who knows? But the project team have been a little bit slow getting back requirements.
Slightly cheaper. We've seen this before, haven't we?
We have, yeah. Hard to get hold of, hard to chase. However, having said that, you know, communication when it's a global project is also key, because you've got your HRBPs, they're all in country, you've got different time zones, so you need to define again from project initiation what is our best method of communication. And actually, again, coming in mid-project, what was being used was pushed by the vendor, and actually it wasn't working for the project team. They openly said straight away, no, we hate this, let's go to Teams, like we want Teams. So yeah, we actually made a quick decision of,
so you made some decisions on like project governance, just to make sure that everybody was on board.
Yeah, what's going to help with communication? I said, you know, at the end of the day, what is going to get us answers and what's going to get them quick? We don't want to make this implementation hard for anybody. So we quickly switched on to Teams, and actually within 24 hours, everyone got their requirements back to us. So with a shift of a go live date, potentially for the other countries, which made them happier, you know, they were on board. They felt their opinion was valued, that it was taken into consideration. So you could say it was quite a project rescue at its finest.
We have got a couple of the biggest mistakes you guys see companies make when it comes to global payroll transformations. The
biggest mistake I feel organisations make when implementing a global HR and payroll solution is that they don't consult the SMEs on the project team as much as what they should when making decisions about configuration, processes, deadlines, timeline, project go live dates. Comms and communication, engagement, it's not just around the wider organisation, it starts with the project team.
If payroll is treated as downstream rather than foundational, of course, in terms of a system from a technical perspective, payroll is that end output. For employees to get paid correctly, everything usually feeds through. If you are an organisation that is heavily shift-based, you know, you're reliant on workforce management, again, those calculations, they all feed through into payroll. But the mistake here is considering that payroll endpoint last rather than first. Payroll needs to be treated as, you know, a service experience and not just a calculation engine. Of course, as you'll be aware, if employees are paid correctly, if their payslips facts are long and complex and confusing, if you're not considering that employee experience as an output from payroll and how the managers interact with that payroll output as well, then this will cause major issues. Of course, you can have a great system. It all calculates as you expect in the timesheets. Then, you know, your onboarding new hire process that works. But if payroll is not designed exactly as you need to, as per your business processes, your operating model, then that ultimately has an impact on the user adoption and that employee experience as well. So I would definitely recommend as a starting point to be thinking of, you know, how payroll should be operating globally before selecting how it would be delivered technically.
If payroll transformation primarily being about technology, I think thinking that, you know, these projects are just about getting the system in they're not. It's about standardization, it's about governance, it's about ownership, it's about making sure that your team knows how they're operating, it's about making improvements to your ways of working. Technology just enables it. So technology will enable all of these things to come to fruition, but you have to build all the stepping stones in the background as well to support that. So don't just think of it as putting a system in and switching it on. Think about how you operate and how you function as an organisation. Thinking
I
about
hope this
payroll
was
transformation.
useful to you today. If we can resonate with any of the things that I've talked to you about and the team have talked to you about today, do get in touch. Here at Silvercloud, we love HR and payroll transformation projects, and we'd love to see what we can do with you in the future if some of these things resonate with you.